If you have been in the furry fandom for a while, then it's quite possible that you might have come across news stories where furries are involved in some sort of violent act.
Or we will make you leave! You
Oh,
Good evening. A man dressed in an animal costume has been attacked in Rundle Mall. The victim telling 9 News he was the target of a hate crime.
Hi everyone, this is Zylie the Fox, and welcome to a new video. A while ago, I made a video about the fact that it was quite safe to sit around Buenos Aires, the city where I live. But I am not ignorant of how hard it might be in other places of the world. Just in the United States alone, there are places where Therian-like attitudes have been confusing for the media, which has led authorities to make ridicule during their legislation. We could go the extra mile and explore countless scenarios, and the conclusion will almost always be the same. The furry fandom is a little misunderstood.
The victim telling 9 News he was the target of a hate crime.
Which is now being investigated by police.
In line with these notorious acts, and given the long history of the furry community over the last decades, the word violence emerges in a social context where many tend to take it for granted. And it is here that I'd like to draw some attention as to what I understand as violence, and of course the implications this word has. In the past, I've always seen the word violence as a physical reaction, but in recent years, the word has undergone a series of resignifications. Therefore, let's define it as a combination of not only physical acts, but a reaction aiming at emotional damage as well. In this line, the furry fandom has been involved and targeted, but at the same time, as we have been seen as victims, we have been also attackers to both the outside world and, believe it or not, among ourselves too. We could talk about violences in the furry fandom, but in the plural. There's violence towards the furry fandom, but it's also violence from the furry fandom, as there is also violence within our community. When I say violence towards the furry fandom, I refer to the role the fandom often plays as a target or as a victim of these acts. While there are certain moments of explicit aggression like bullying, harassment, or even physical attacks, what often gets overlooked is the more subtle and persistent form of violence, and that is symbolic violence. This kind of violence doesn't always leave bruises or break bones, but it does shape public opinion, social narratives, and institutional responses. Symbolic violence, as theorized by thinkers like Pierre Bourdieu, refer to the internalized and therefore normalized ways that society marginalizes certain groups through language, through discourse, and, of course, through representation. In the case of furries, symbolic violence comes from more than just misinformed individuals. It's reinforced by long-standing cultural beliefs passed down through conservative generations, and by the unease many feel when confronted with something they don't generally understand. Let's be real, we all fear something, and often what we fear most is the unknown. It's easy to ridicule or attack what we don't understand than it is to take the time to learn about it. The furry fandom is no exception to this. But the difference here is that this symbolic violence is not just happening at the interpersonal level. It's been perpetuated by larger forces, mainstream media, state institutions, and popular discourse. These systems help shape the public's perception, reducing a diverse and creative community to caricatures of deviance or absurdity. And the result of this? Well, we see harmful policies like Russia's banning on civilians on furries and quadrovers, or restrictionary movements on some United States states, trying to restrict so-called furry behavior in schools. You might have seen the Texas case.
A student exhibiting non-human behaviors or identifying as an animal in the classroom is not a civil rights issue.
In light of this, when we talk about violence towards the furry fandom, we should broaden our understanding. It's not just about isolated incidents of aggression, it's also about the ecosystem of misinformation, discrimination, targeted, and persecution. What we see in the real world, be it harassment, assault, or public shaming, is not the beginning of the problem, it's the result actually. It's the visible outcome of a much deeper, invisible structure. There's a tendency in our society to simplify everything, to reduce complex social phenomena to what we can see and measure, without ever questioning where it comes from and why it happens in the first place. But understanding violence towards the furry community requires us to move beyond the spectacle of visible harm and instead interrogate the invisible forces that legitimize it. Just as there's misinformation from the part of big media, and therefore a violent misconception of furries, I also believe that we furries lack some empathy when it comes to large gatherings. In order to address the second preposition to describe this phenomenon, I want to focus on the actions from the furry fandom that sometimes go unnoticed, but which could be unintentionally violent to the outside world. At the heart of this phenomenon lies a paradox. The very feeling of comfort and freedom that, for example, a furry convention or the fandom itself might offer can become the catalyst for a certain carelessness. These events allow furries to finally be themselves, fully and without restraint. But as sociologist Zygmun Bauman suggests in his work on liquid modernity, communities that are built around shared emotions or identities can become islands of certainty in an uncertain world. Within these islands, individuals may develop blind spots to the social norms that govern the outside world. That is, our own spaces become too safe and we lose sight of how our behaviors resonate beyond their borders. Take conventions for example. To us, they are joyous, expressive, and playful spaces, but to outsiders, this same energy can appear disruptive, invasive, or even threatening. The loud performances in hotels, disregards for common spaces, or overtly sexual behavior sometimes in semi-public areas may unintentionally generate discomfort. These are not violent acts per se, but as Pierre Bourdieu theorized in his concept of symbolic violence, they operate through perception and social codes, subtly establishing hierarchies of who belongs and who doesn't. When furries disregard how their presence is read by others, they risk turning joy into a kind of imposed spectacle, one that enacts social pressure rather than inclusion. Symbolic violence from the fandom, then, is not about intentional harm. It's about the unexamined consequences of feeling too at home in shared spaces. We stop seeing the hotel lobby as shared with other guests, for example, and then we stop considering the staff experiences. We act with the confidence of being among kin, forgetting that some of our kinship behaviors can alienate others. In other words, social comfort makes symbolic violence invisible to those performing it. Within the fandom itself, symbolic violence also takes root. A space that prides itself on acceptance and tolerance is not exempt from the fractures that affect any human group. And in fact, symbolic violence inside the fandom can be especially insidious because it hides behind the language of inclusion. It is important to be fair. The furry fandom has historically taken a strong stance against genuinely harmful behavior. It is often the first to call out instances of animal abuse, predatory behavior, or bigotry. In many ways, this makes the community a safer space. But the issue arises when this vigilance transforms into cancel culture, a hypersensitivity that distorts what should be ethical accountability into emotional punishment. This is where violence within begins to take shape. Symbolic violence in this context often presents itself as social exclusion, the silencing or ostracization of members who are labeled as cringe, problematic, or attention-seeking in some cases. These judgments may sometimes have merit, but more often than not, they stem from herd mentality, a collective reaction based on heresy, jealousy, or the fear of associating with quote-unquote wrong person. It's not that the community is inherently malicious, rather it's deeply reactive, and in that emotional reactivity, the line between justice and bullying becomes dangerously thin. In general, and not intending to put any specific case, I can see that some popular personalities in the fandom could be accused of clout chasing, for example, without actually being ill-intentioned. Sometimes the humor they produce might not be liked, but it is healthy, in contrast to risky behavior some others might be involved into. In this line, a tendency which is not very nice could arise, and as a consequence, new voices might be drowned out for not fitting the aesthetics or the politics of the majority. What does this mean? Well, at first sight, we could say that gatekeeping emerges, not as a formal structure, but as an unspoken code that determines who is allowed to thrive and who is to be pushed out. It becomes a fandom where being liked is less about merit and more about knowing the right people, or avoiding, let's say, the wrong narratives, if you know what I mean. The result is a chilling emotional climate where symbolic violence manifests through mockery, passive-aggressive callouts, and coordinated silences. The fear of being ostracized leads many to self-censor, to withdraw, or in some extreme cases, to leave the fandom altogether, alienated not by outsiders, but interestingly enough, by their own community. What becomes clear after reflecting on all this is that symbolic violence isn't a one-way street. It's a cycle, one that constantly shifts its direction towards, from, and within the furry fandom. Acts of misunderstanding and mockery from the outside world can shape how we are perceived and treated. But at the same time, moments of carelessness or entitlement from us, even when unintentional, can spark discomfort or backlash that reopens the door for further violence towards us. And when we turn on each other, driven by envy, herd mentality, or distorted ideas of justice, the wounds go even deeper. The most troubling part is how these dynamics often feed each other. A lack of self-awareness within the fandom may lead to negative reactions from society, which then reinforce the outsider aggression towards us that we claim to be victims of. It is a cycle that results in real-world consequences. Cancel conventions, lost public trust, media scorn, and even legislation rooted in fear and misinformation, just to quote a few examples. But we don't have to stay trapped in that cycle. Understanding symbolic violence isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing the power of social comfort and how easily it can be turned into carelessness. If we want to build a fandom that's truly inclusive, resilient, and respected, then empathy has to flow in every direction, not just from the outside in, but from within outwards too. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you liked it, comment, subscribe, and like, and share it with your friends if you want to spread the word. I hope to see you guys in the next one. Take good care of yourselves.